The Don runs his world through fear and absolute mistrust. Enemies are external, spies are always internal. His latest obsession, the new household maid, a whisper of a woman whose pervasive shyness fuels the boss's deep-seated paranoia. She is either utterly harmless or the most dangerous kind of operative. He must know. He stages the ultimate psychological trap, feigning unconsciousness in his private study, the epicenter of his darkest secrets. As the maid enters, the air is thick with anticipated violence. The boss is ready to strike, expecting theft or intel gathering, but the simple, utterly unforeseen action she takes instantly dismantles his carefully constructed reality, freezing the most ruthless man in the city with a sudden, devastating vulnerability. The gilded library at the Ashworth estate was not merely a repository for rare leather-bound texts. It was the fortress within the fortress, the soundproofed heart of Gideon Vance's sprawling criminal enterprise. The room absorbed sound and light with oppressive efficiency, its rich mahogany paneling and velvet draperies creating a silence that felt less like quietude and more like a vacuum of trust. Gideon Vance, 44, a man whose intensity was etched into the sharp angles of his face and the piercing clarity of his blue eyes, rarely allowed stillness into his life, much less vulnerability. Yet today, he sat slumped in the Chesterfield armchair, a monumental piece of leather craftsmanship positioned strategically beneath a dusty chandelier. He appeared to be in a deep, unguarded sleep, his heavy cashmere blazer slightly askew, a posture engineered to broadcast exhaustion and complete security. The truth was, a high-voltage wire stretched taut beneath the surface of his stillness. Every muscle in his body was relaxed just enough to mimic slumber, yet his mind was a sophisticated surveillance system, processing the faint sounds of the massive house settling around him. His eyes, though shuttered, registered the minimal light changes as the afternoon sun shifted. Vance was conducting a psychological experiment, the most dangerous kind, one where the test subject was granted access to the core vulnerabilities of her master. Vance's paranoia was not the whimsical fear of a tyrant. It was the refined operational necessity of a man constantly targeted by rivals, law enforcement, and internal betrayals. He trusted technology more than people, and he trusted fear more than loyalty. This skepticism had recently coalesced around one individual, Clara Nielsen, 25, the newest addition to the household staff. Clara was defined by her absence of presence. She possessed a slight build, wore only neutral-colored, almost monastic clothing, and maintained a perpetually lowered gaze that suggested she was constantly apologizing for taking up space. She was, in Vance's cold analysis, too meek. In a house filled with loud personalities, sharp edges, and forced confidence, Clara Nielsen was an anomaly, blending into the background so perfectly that Vance suspected she must be deliberately hiding. Her shyness felt synthetic, an elaborate camouflage for something lethal, an informant perhaps, or a highly trained operative specializing in invisibility. For weeks, Vance had monitored her patterns. She performed her tasks with obsessive meticulousness, dusting the deepest recesses of the estate, spending 3 hours every Thursday afternoon cleaning and polishing the gilded library, a task generally completed by others in half the time. Her routine was flawless, yet her avoidance of eye contact bordered on the pathological. Vance needed to strip away that protective layer, and the only way to do that was to give her what she craved: total, unchallenged privacy in the most sensitive location. He had fabricated the perfect opportunity. His security chief, Silas, was ostensibly away on a critical overnight mission, and Vance had loudly dismissed his personal guard detail for the afternoon, claiming a debilitating headache. The study's doors were locked from the inside, but only to deter immediate, external intrusions. The key to the outer lock was prominently displayed on a hook next to the service entrance. Everything was calibrated to suggest, "I am alone. I am weak. The opportunity is now." Vance registered the faint, almost imperceptible clink from the hall. It was the sound of the key turning, the mechanism silent save for that single metallic interaction. Clara was punctual. His internal command center went on high alert. He controlled his heart rate with a disciplined focus honed over decades of high-stakes confrontation. He had anticipated her movements. She would enter, confirm his compromised state, then move immediately toward the secure bookshelf wall where the digital command center was concealed, or perhaps she would target the documents scattered on the massive oak desk, seemingly carelessly left out. He was prepared for the slightest rustle of paper, the click of a tiny camera, the whisper into a hidden mic. If she moved toward the control panel, he would be upon her in 3 seconds, his paralyzing wrath instant and overwhelming. The door eased open. Not a creak, not a slam, but a fluid motion that spoke to controlled strength and meticulous care. A faint scent of lemon polish and ozone, her signature cleaning materials, drifted into the dense air. Clara Nielsen entered the room. Vance sensed her approach long before she was physically close. Her movements were unnervingly light, her footfalls swallowed entirely by the antique Persian rug. She moved first, as expected, to the far corners of the room, executing the dusting routine that was her official mandate. She polished the brass fittings of the light fixtures, her slight frame stretching carefully. Her back was to Vance, yet he could feel the radiating tension of her awareness. She knew he was there, and she knew he was supposedly asleep. The agonizing crawl of time amplified the silence. Vance could hear the subtle rush of blood in his own ears, the minimal shift of fabric against the leather of the Chesterfield armchair. He waited for the deviation. Clara finished the high surfaces, then approached the desk. Vance braced himself, preparing for the lethal spring. This was the moment. The desk held innocuous-looking ledgers, but also several documents whose brief exposure could dismantle entire aspects of his overseas operations. She reached the desk. Her hand, slender and pale, stopped inches from a folder marked Zurich Holdings. Instead of touching it, she paused, her head tilted slightly as if listening not to external sounds, but to an internal tremor. Then she did the first unexpected thing. She ran her fingers over the smooth surface of the mahogany, checking for dust in a purely professional manner, then moved on. She circled the desk, cleaning the inkwells and the edges of the blotter, carefully navigating around the sensitive material without acknowledging its existence. Vance found this deviation perplexing. A professional operative would take the risk, regardless of the potential danger. Was she that good? Was this deep psychological warfare? The refusal to acknowledge the bait signaling superior confidence? She then approached the Chesterfield armchair, moving with a soft reverence that was bizarrely out of place. Vance felt the wave of cold air as she moved past him. He could smell the faint starch of her collar, the clean scent of her hair. His entire focus was fixed on the precise spatial relationship between her hand and his body. He was ready to erupt into violent action. Clara stopped directly behind the chair. She wasn't dusting the leather, nor was she attempting any physical act of violence. Vance felt her pause, a moment of profound hesitation, her slight shadow falling across his face. Then she bent down, not to attack, but to address the floor. She produced a soft cloth and meticulously wiped the dust from the delicate wood carvings on the armchair's legs. It was a task so mundane, so subservient, that it momentarily fractured Vance's focus. He had expected high-stakes betrayal. He received domestic servitude, amplified to an almost religious degree. Clara finished the base of the chair and moved a short distance away, stopping in the small, sun-drenched patch of floor near the grand stone fireplace, a patch usually reserved for quiet reading. She leaned against the cool marble hearth. Vance waited for her to survey the room, to pull out the spy gear, but she didn't. Instead, Clara slowly sank down to the thick rug, settling herself in a posture that suggested complete mental and physical exhaustion, as if the mask of meekness had become too heavy to bear. She looked small in the vast, echoing space. She did not look at Vance. She stared at the faint moving motes of dust dancing in the sunlight beam. This was the critical, uncontrolled variable. She had completed her required duties without sabotage or espionage, yet she had not left. She remained, electing to stay in the heart of his power, believing she was alone. Clara then reached slowly into the inner pocket of her neutral-colored apron. Her hand emerged clasping a single small object, the sterling silver locket. The locket was old, tarnished silver, worn smooth by constant handling. It looked utterly out of place against the backdrop of Vance's ruthless modern empire. She opened the locket. Vance could not see the contents, but her gaze softened, transforming the sharp, fearful lines around her eyes into something fragile and almost luminous. She held the small object tightly, pressing it against her breastbone, closing her eyes. Vance's mind raced. Was it a dead man's switch? A trigger for a device? A hidden camera concealed within the silver casing? He mentally ran through contingency plans. If she pressed it, he would be on her instantly. But she didn't press it. The silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. Then Clara Nielsen, the shy, almost invisible maid, began to make a sound. It was not a word. It was a melody. It started as a breathy, almost inaudible hum, a sound so delicate it barely disturbed the dust motes. It was a melody that felt ancient, mournful, and impossibly pure. It was a lullaby, perhaps, or a lament, sung in a key that seemed to exist only in the deeper chambers of memory and sorrow. As the melody gathered strength, Vance felt the first true jolt of paralysis. His finely tuned expectations, betrayal, theft, violence, were instantly rendered obsolete. He had prepared for a bomb. He was struck by a whisper. The soundproofing of the gilded library, designed to keep the sounds of the outside world out, now functioned as an amplifier for this utterly unexpected human expression. The mahogany walls, usually absorbing every sound of criminality and strategic planning, now resonated with the clear, unadulterated tone of Clara Nielsen's voice. Her voice was an instrument of shocking hidden talent. It possessed an alto richness, controlled yet brimming with suppressed emotion. It wasn't the trained, polished sound of a professional singer. It was the raw, heartbreaking output of a soul completely stripped bare, singing only for itself. The lyrics, when they finally emerged, were in a language Vance did not recognize, perhaps an old dialect or merely nonsense syllables designed to carry the feeling, but the emotional content was immediate and devastatingly clear. A profound, aching loneliness, combined with an intense, desperate memory of solace. Gideon Vance, the man who had faced down assassins, survived explosions, and ordered the executions of those who hesitated, found himself utterly frozen within the Chesterfield armchair. The paralysis was not physical, it was cognitive. His brain, accustomed to threat matrices and calculated risk, could not categorize this sensory input. This sound, this pure, crystalline, sorrowful sound, was an attack on his established reality. He was trapped by the sheer incongruity. This voice belonged to a person of immense internal complexity, a sensitivity that seemed impossible to maintain in the brutal ecosystem of the Ashworth estate. Yet, here it was, pouring from the throat of the woman he had labeled Suspect 7. Clara sang for what felt like an eternity. Her eyes remained closed, her head tilted slightly back, her small frame radiating an unexpected fierce strength derived solely from vulnerability. She was completely lost in the moment, utterly convinced of her solitude. Vance found that his carefully regulated breathing had become shallow, irregular. He felt a burning pressure behind his eyes. He had to move. He had to shatter the illusion, expose her, and demand an explanation. But the raw beauty held him captive, locking his muscles, turning his calculated rage into a bewildering, intellectual terror. If she was a spy, why the locket? Why the song? No intelligence agency would deploy a hidden weapon capable of such profound, unnecessary artistry. The depth of feeling in the room contradicted the very existence of a calculated motive. The climax of the song arrived, a sudden, heart-wrenching rise in pitch that broke against the marble hearth and echoed softly off the shelves of forgotten knowledge. It was a sound of absolute, complete surrender to grief. Vance realized he was breathing the same air as someone fundamentally, irrevocably human, in a room he had consecrated to the dehumanizing business of crime. The sheer, terrifying power of her secret was not malice, it was depth. When the melody finally subsided, it didn't end. It faded, trailing off into a sustained, melancholic hum, like a thread pulled slowly through silk. Clara remained silent for a long moment, simply breathing. Her eyes opened slowly, blinking rapidly as she returned to the oppressive reality of the study. She looked exhausted, as if the song had cost her a tremendous physical effort. She slowly tucked the sterling silver locket back into her apron pocket, the click of the closure a tiny punctuation mark ending the profound intimacy. She then stood, retrieved her cleaning materials and glanced briefly, almost reflexively, at the imposing, sleeping figure of Gideon Vance, 44, slumped in the Chesterfield armchair. She saw a ruthless tyrant at rest. Vance felt the weight of her glance, but maintained his flawless charade. The effort was now doubled because his mind was reeling, trying to assimilate the fact that the greatest threat he had faced all day was not a micro-explosive or a data leak, but a ballad. Clara Nielsen, 25, then executed the final professional stages of her routine. She tidied the floor area near the hearth, moved silently to the door, and with the same practiced soft click, she exited the gilded library, locking the heavy door behind her. The moment the lock turned, Vance's control snapped. He did not bolt upright. Instead, a single involuntary tremor ran down his spine, settling deep in his core. He kept his eyes closed, listening to the echoes of the silence which now felt louder and far more menacing than the sound of the song. He slowly, meticulously, allowed his muscles to relax from the feigned rigor mortis. He opened his eyes. The room looked the same, the mahogany, the books, the imposing desk, but everything was fundamentally altered. The test had yielded a result, but it was one that rendered his entire defensive structure useless. Clara Nielsen was not hiding a wire. She was hiding an entire parallel universe of emotional intensity. The vulnerable Maid was gone, replaced by a dangerous enigma. Her invisibility was not tactical. It was a necessary shield against a world that would crush such profound vulnerability. Vance pushed himself slowly out of the Chesterfield armchair. The seat of his supposed authority now felt contaminated by his own successful deception. He walked to the window, the sunlight beam where she had sat still visible. The air felt charged with the ghost of the melody. He was Gideon Vance, the master of deceit and strategic violence. Yet in the space of 3 minutes, the quiet Maid had exposed a catastrophic blind spot in his ability to judge character. She had revealed a secret so raw, so powerful, that it demanded a radical reassessment of everything he believed about control and motivation. A person capable of concealing that level of artistry and pain was capable of anything. He had expected a threat he could neutralize with force or money. He received an intimate revelation he couldn't even categorize. The Maid was no longer a low-level suspect. She was a variable of terrifying magnitude. He stood staring out at the expansive, cold grounds of the Ashworth estate, grasping the chilling realization. He had been completely paralyzed by beauty, and he now had no idea if Clara Nielsen was the most dangerous enemy he had ever faced, or simply the most profoundly unhappy person in his house. The ambiguity itself was his new, terrifying weakness. His carefully constructed worldview had failed, shattered by a sound she never intended him to hear. The moment the heavy oak door of the gilded library clicked shut, sealing the profound silence behind Clara, Gideon allowed the facade to crumble. It was not a sudden movement, but a slow, agonizing unwinding. The muscles in his neck, held rigid for 20 minutes in the simulation of deep, restful sleep, spasmed violently. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, inhaling deeply, trying to clear the lingering presence of lemon polish and the far more potent, dizzying scent of raw vulnerability. He had expected the adrenaline rush of confrontation, the cold clarity of immediate neutralizing action. Instead, his system was flooded with an unsettling cocktail of aesthetic shock and cognitive dissonance. The man who orchestrated global violence with a detached hand found himself physically shaken by a mournful, unaccompanied alto. Gideon walked slowly to the massive oak desk, his polished shoes silent on the aged rug. He didn't sit. He merely leaned against the cold wood, staring at the scattered documents he had used as bait. The Zurich holdings file, the itinerary for the Milan shipment. In his strategic mind, these were irresistible targets for a spy. Clara had walked right past them, driven by an internal gravity far stronger than external greed or political motive. He began a ruthless debriefing of himself, running the entire sequence through his mental threat matrix. Action. Maid enters private study, confirms boss is incapacitated. Opportunity. Unfettered access to sensitive data and critical infrastructure, the hidden security station. Result. Ignored sensitive data. Ignored infrastructure. Sat on the floor and sang a sorrowful private melody while holding an antique locket. He traced the outline of the security console hidden behind a row of Goethe. If she had simply tapped the mahogany panel twice, he would have broken cover, neutralized her, and the incident would have been filed under routine betrayal terminated. Instead, the incident was filed under uncategorized phenomenon, existential threat. Gideon walked over to where she had sat near the fireplace. The light beam had shifted, but the impression of her presence remained. The profound sadness of the song still clung to the air, an invisible film of memory and sorrow. He recognized the depth of the emotion. It was too pure, too unfiltered to be manufactured. It was the sound of someone completely alone, completely unguarded, convinced that the impenetrable fortress of the gilded library was her confessional. Why here? The Ashworth estate to Gideon was a cage built for protection and power. To Clara, it must be a gilded prison. This room, soundproofed and detached, offered the only space where her private self could momentarily surface without immediate risk of exposure or destruction. She wasn't seeking intelligence. She was seeking sanctuary for a broken heart. This realization, however, did not soothe Gideon. It intensified his fear. A woman who could live within this environment, maintain that flawless mask of subservience, perform her duties with clinical perfection, and yet possess a reservoir of feeling deep enough to produce that kind of auditory art, was a living weapon of compartmentalization. Her capacity for concealment dwarfed his own. He picked up the soft linen cloth she had used to dust the base of the Chesterfield armchair. It smelled faintly of lemon and something metallic, perhaps the silver of the locket, or simply the cold air of the room. He held it for a moment, an inanimate object that had been touched by a person now elevated in his mind from minor nuisance to critical obsession. Gideon returned to the window. The sunlight seemed colder now. His usual state of paranoia was a high-functioning system of warnings and countermeasures. This new feeling was an incapacitating dread, a realization that the foundational rules of his world, that every action is transactional and every vulnerability is manufactured, were incorrect. Clara had exposed a truth outside of his command, that some people harbor secrets purely for the sake of survival, not for exploitation. He reviewed the history of her employment. She had been hired 6 weeks ago through a reputable, though somewhat obscure, agency specializing in discreet domestic stuff. Her background checks were clean. A small-town upbringing, minimal social media footprint, vocational school for hospitality. The records painted a picture of utter ordinariness. Now Gideon understood. The ordinariness was the ultimate camouflage. He activated the hidden communication panel on the bookshelf and spoke, his voice clipped and strained. "Silas, cancel all movements. I need you back at the estate within the hour. No questions. No deviations." Silas, his security chief, was supposed to be halfway to the city. The mission was critical, but Gideon now understood that the biggest security threat was internal, subtle, and emotional. He couldn't risk leaving Clara unsupervised in this new context. He disconnected the call before Silas could respond. The urgency was palpable. He had to pivot his entire strategy. He could no longer treat Clara as a conventional suspect. He had to approach her as a highly sensitive asset, or a potential liability of enormous psychological consequence. Gideon walked over to the Chesterfield armchair and ran his hand over the worn leather. He had used the chair to project false vulnerability, but in that moment of feigned sleep, the true vulnerability wasn't his. It was hers, broadcast to an unwilling, terrifyingly capable audience of one. He sat down, not to rest, but to strategize. His analysis of the situation had to shift from what is she trying to take to what is she trying to protect. The locket. He needed to know what was in the locket. If it was a picture of a lost lover, a child, or a family member, it confirmed profound personal grief. If it contained a coded microdot or a piece of a device, the song was merely cover. But the power of the performance argued against the latter. No operative, no matter how highly trained, could fake that depth of sorrow while remaining acutely aware of the risk of discovery. Gideon needed to create a new test, a test that targeted her emotional center, not her professional capacity. A test designed to force a controlled breach of her self-imposed isolation. He stared across the room, imagining the fragile figure near the hearth. He had watched Clara in that state of profound artistic exposure. He remembered the shift in her eyes when they opened, a momentary terror quickly suppressed as she remembered where she was, transforming back into the perpetually lowered gaze Gideon had initially observed. That quick, defensive transformation cemented his operational decision. She must never know that he heard the song. To let her know would be to shatter the sanctuary she had created and potentially trigger an unpredictable, explosive reaction. She was safe only if she believed the secret remained solely hers. This placed Gideon in an impossible ethical bind for a man of his stature. He was now complicit in her secret. He was the keeper of her vulnerability. This strange, intimate knowledge gave him power, but it also tied him to her in a way that felt dangerously personal. He stood again, moving with a renewed, cold focus. He needed to adjust the variables of the Ashworth estate to accommodate this unprecedented internal force. First, security protocols needed an overhaul. He would increase surveillance on the domestic staff, not to find Clara, but to ensure that no one else witnessed her moments of vulnerability. Her secret was now a matter of national security. His nation, the Kincaid organization. If a rival family discovered that the shy maid could be manipulated by exploiting deep emotional pain, she became an instant and potent lever against him. Second, he needed proximity. He couldn't keep her away from the gilded library. Her presence was routine. He would instead increase his own presence in the areas where she worked, ostensibly for productivity reasons. He needed to watch her, not with suspicion, but with the detailed observation required to study a new, highly specialized life form. He considered the risk. By keeping her close, he risked exposure to that destabilizing force again. The music had bypassed his defenses entirely, striking directly at the emotional core he thought he had surgically removed decades ago. It was a terrifying vulnerability. The transformation into enigma. Gideon understood that the shy, meek persona was not a lie. It was a necessary survival mechanism. Clara was not hiding malice, she was hiding intensity. She was meticulous because precision was her only defense against chaos. Her invisibility was not strategic infiltration. It was simply the safest place for someone with so much raw internal volume. This realization flipped the script on his entire operation. He had spent his life dealing with individuals whose motives were blunt instruments. Clara was a silent, perfectly honed blade of sorrow. The irony of the situation was a sharp, biting pain. He, the master of control, was now being controlled by a silent pact of non-acknowledgement. He couldn't ask, "Why did you sing?" Because the answer was implicit. Because I am hurting and I thought no one could hear. Gideon walked to his private liquor cabinet, not for a drink, but to retrieve the small, locked journal where he logged sensitive, non-digital intelligence. He opened it to a fresh page, the heavy, expensive paper waiting for the entry. He wrote the date, 2024. He paused. How to categorize her? Informant? No. Operative? Unlikely. Target? Unacceptable risk. He wrote, unconfirmed variable. High potential for destabilization. Motive? Emotional pain. This entire exercise felt absurd. His journal usually listed names of politicians for blackmail or coordinates for weapons caches. Now it contained the emotional profile of a cleaning woman. He closed the journal and tucked it away. He looked at the Chesterfield armchair. The feigned slumber had achieved its goal, but the result was not the anticipated capture of an enemy, but the acquisition of a terrifying mystery. Gideon needed to know the origin of that song. He needed to understand the hidden talent that could produce such emotional intensity. Was she self-taught? Was she a failed professional? Did the locket represent the source of her musical gift or the source of her grief? He stood in the massive, mahogany-paneled room, feeling smaller than he had in years. His ability to judge character, the cornerstone of his survival, had failed him completely. The woman he had dismissed as low-level had, in a single unguarded moment, revealed herself to be the single most complex human being within his security perimeter. He decided on the immediate next steps. He couldn't reveal his knowledge, but he needed more data. The observation needed to become clinical, almost surgical. He would move one of his private surveillance feeds, one usually reserved for rivals, to the service corridors, focusing on her movements when she thought she was truly alone. He needed to discover if the performance in the Gilded Library was a singular breach or a routine outlet. He walked toward the desk and began sifting through the documents, trying to re-establish the familiar rhythm of tactical operations. But the numbers blurred. The intricate details of financial maneuvers seemed meaningless in the face of that profound, sorrowful sound. The maid was now paradoxically the central figure in his life. She was the problem he couldn't solve with violence or money. She demanded a level of engagement and understanding that Gideon had successfully avoided for decades. He considered ordering her termination, a final, ruthless solution to an uncontrolled variable. The thought surfaced, cold and clinical, but died almost immediately. The voice. The sheer, terrifying beauty of the voice rendered her untouchable. To silence that sound would be to commit a crime against something far beyond law or morality, a destruction of fragile, powerful art. Gideon realized the deeper paralysis. He was not frozen by fear of a threat he could analyze. He was frozen by an unwelcome, disruptive fascination. He spent the next hour reconstructing the timeline of the event, meticulously detailing the pitch, tempo, and emotional arc of the song, cataloging the data as if it were intelligence on a hostile nation's military capability. He noted the specific moment she opened the sterling silver locket, just before the first, breathy hum. The locket was the trigger, the key that unlocked the profound talent and the immense grief. He made a mental note to initiate discreet inquiries into antique silver lockets sold in the city over the last 2 years, an investigation that would require extreme discretion and a team he barely trusted. He needed to maintain the illusion of control. When Silas arrived, Gideon had to project his usual, impenetrable aura of authority. He had to act as if his test had confirmed the maid was harmless, while internally, he was adjusting the coordinates of his entire psychological map. He moved to the door and locked it from the outside, ensuring the key was returned to its prominent hook near the service entrance. This was routine. The room was soundproofed and secured, but as he turned to leave, Gideon glanced back at the gilded library. The room felt immense, heavy, and strangely intimate. He was Gideon, the master of the Ashworth estate, the ruthless leader of a sprawling criminal enterprise. But now, he was also the unwilling confidant of his shy maid's deepest secret. The power had shifted. He held her secret, but she held the power to shatter his carefully maintained psychological equilibrium. He stepped out into the silent hall, the echoes of a mournful song vibrating in the fortress he had built against the world. He was no longer looking for a spy or an enemy. He was looking at the vast, terrifying possibility that the greatest risks in his life were not the ones that carried a gun, but the ones that carried a debilitating, heart-wrenching tune. The maid was no longer a variable. She was a profound, bewildering reflection of the humanity he had long ago chosen to bury. His control, once absolute, was now tethered to the fragile emotional state of Clara, the woman who sang her sorrow into the mahogany walls of his command center. He understood, with chilling clarity, that the test had not revealed her weakness, but his own. The enigma remained, standing silently in the periphery of his power, profoundly dangerous not because of what she might do, but because of who she profoundly was. Conclusion. Ensuring no cliffhanger. Gideon paused at the intersection of the main hall and the service corridor, listening. He could hear the faint, distant sounds of domestic activity, a light clink of silver, the muted rush of water, the low hum of the estate's ventilation system. He listened specifically for any sound that betrayed Clara's location, any movement that suggested anxiety or recognition. There was nothing. She had slipped back into her role, the mask of meekness, perfectly reset. He knew she would be back tomorrow, adhering to her meticulous schedule, cleaning the same surfaces, moving with the same studied invisibility. And he, the man who commanded legions and inspired terror, would find himself once again holding his breath, waiting for the subtle internal tremor that might reveal another fraction of her hidden self. He felt the cold, hard weight of a new responsibility, not to destroy her but to understand her, a task infinitely more complex and dangerous than any act of violence he had ever commissioned. The operation was over. The conclusion was the permanent acceptance of an unresolved psychological conflict. His domain was built on predictability. Clara was the living, breathing antidote to that control. Gideon walked away from the service entrance, leaving the silence of the hall unbroken, profoundly aware that the simplest, quietest person in his house was the one he now feared the most. The immediate arrival of Silas shattered the brief, sterile solitude Gideon had cultivated. Silas, a man built like granite and possessed of an instinct for trouble that bordered on the supernatural, did not knock. He entered the adjacent receiving room silently, his presence an abrupt, chilling correction to the relaxed posture Gideon had momentarily allowed himself. Gideon met him in the connecting hallway, a narrow strip of marble separating the public face of the estate from its operational core. Gideon's face was a masterpiece of cold, professional exhaustion. The profound internal shock he had experienced was buried deep beneath layers of habitual authority. "A report," Gideon commanded, his voice perfectly modulated, betraying neither urgency nor distraction. Silas, however, was trained to read the atmospheric pressure in Gideon's domain. He noted the subtle shift. The air around Gideon felt too taut, less like the control of a satisfied commander, and more like the strained composure of a man who had just absorbed a silent, catastrophic impact. The Milan shipment is stable. Minor unrest in Genoa, handled. I cut the timeline short, per your instructions. What's the situation here? Security breach? Silas' eyes, dark, assessing, flickered toward the entrance to the gilded library. Negative. No breach. Internal adjustment, Gideon replied, leaning against the cold marble balustrade. He couldn't risk revealing the true nature of the disruption. To frame Clara as a threat meant initiating a protocol that led, inevitably, to violence. And violence, in this context, felt like crushing a priceless, fragile artifact simply because it was confusing. Adjustment where? Everything was running to spec when I left, Silas pressed, his professional concern warring with years of learned deference. Personnel, Silas. Specific, non-critical staff rotation. I want a full review of the current domestic roster. Cross-reference all agency placements from the last 3 months against active surveillance targets in competing syndicates. Focus on anomalies in routine behavior, specifically those exhibiting overcompensation. Too quiet, too efficient, too much attention to detail. Concerned with engineered invisibility. Gideon spoke with deliberate vagueness, turning his personal obsession into a generalized security directive. He was, in effect, ordering Silas to hunt for a spy. Knowing full well the real issue was a broken heart, Silas processed the request, his brow furrowed slightly. Domestic staff, you're concerned about the cleaners, Gideon. After the Zurich situation, I'd think our attention should be on the East Coast operations. Your attention is wherever I direct it, Gideon said, allowing a sliver of ice to enter his tone. The East Coast is predictable. The risks we fail to anticipate often come from the lowest strata, the ones we deem insignificant. I want micro-surveillance on staff movement, effective immediately, nothing obvious. I want to see how they move when they believe they are completely unobserved. Start with the laundry, the pantry, the rear stairwells. He was creating a protective shell around Clara's activity, cloaking his investigation into her emotional life under the guise of general domestic scrutiny. Silas, seeing the intensity in Gideon's eyes, conceded. He knew better than to argue when Gideon shifted his focus onto a new, obscure threat vector. The most dangerous elements of Gideon's power were his sudden, irrational obsessions. Understood. I'll deploy the covert monitoring team. Well, have a preliminary analysis by morning. No, Silas. You will handle the analysis. No team. This information stays between us. We are establishing baseline patterns for potential future infiltration, not reacting to an immediate threat. Absolute discretion. This move effectively cut Silas off from the context, ensuring he wouldn't realize the specific focus was Clara. Gideon needed the data, but he couldn't afford the interpretation of a loyal but blunt instrument like Silas. Silas nodded, still unsettled by the redirection of resources but trusting Gideon's cold calculus. Consider it done. I'll start with the architectural diagrams for placement. As Silas retreated to the command center to begin the new, absurd assignment, Gideon walked back toward the gilded library. He did not re-enter, but merely pressed his hand against the cold mahogany door. The room felt like a recent excavation site, a place where profound buried history had been momentarily unearthed. Gideon's analysis shifted from threat assessment to forensic acoustics. He had the power, the resources and the network to dismantle nations, yet he was using them to decode a private melody. He retreated to his auxiliary command room, a small, heavily shielded bunker beneath the main estate, a space usually reserved for contingency planning in case of full-scale war. Now it was dedicated to Clara. He initiated an extremely compartmentalized inquiry, labeled internally as Project Nightingale, a reference so literary and delicate it felt alien in his brutal world. He contacted an asset in London, a former musicologist who owed Gideon a debt that extended beyond monetary value. The request was simple, yet demanded radical discretion. A sonic profile of a specific vocal range, searching public and private performance archives, specializing in folk lament or operatic training gone quiet. Gideon specified the voice. A pure, untrained but deeply powerful alto, characterized by specific vibrato breaks indicating profound emotional weight, not technical mastery. He had no recording. He had only memory, and the precision of that memory was his current security apparatus. The absurdity was a bitter, exhilarating pill. He was a global crime lord spending his finite operational time listening to the ghost of a Maid's song, hunting for evidence of her musical biography. If any of his lieutenants discovered the true nature of Project Nightingale, his entire reputation for ruthless pragmatism would shatter. Gideon didn't trust the musicologist entirely, so he created a cover story. The voice belonged to a potential political blackmailer, someone threatening to release a damaging private recording to compromise an ally. The wait was agonizing. Time, to Gideon, was a resource measured in tactical efficiency. Now it stretched, filled with the static of anticipation. He found himself physically moving slower, his decisions less immediate, his temper shorter with his usual subordinates who discussed trivial matters of profit and territory. He felt like a general in the middle of a major campaign, suddenly fixated on a single insignificant piece of domestic gossip. He revisited the central item, the sterling silver locket. If the musicologist confirmed that the song structure was derived from a known historical lament, perhaps from a specific European region, it would lend credence to the idea of a family tragedy, a geographical origin point for the grief. If the song was entirely original, it suggested composition, training, or a raw, unprecedented talent. Gideon began mapping Clara's routine movements, now visible through the new covert surveillance feed Silas had installed. He watched her glide through the service areas. She moved with a practiced economy of motion, always in the shadows, always ensuring her path didn't intersect with the higher-ranking staff, or, most critically, Gideon himself. He watched her meticulously polish the antique silver in the dining hall. She approached the inanimate objects with a reverence he had never seen her apply to people. When she touched the metal, there was a brief, almost imperceptible softening around her mouth. These moments were not vulnerabilities. They were confirmations of her obsessive precision, a precision born from fear of error. But sometimes, when she was alone in the vast, echoing pantry, stocking supplies, her hand would unconsciously rise to her neck, where the locket was presumably hidden beneath the high collar of her uniform. She never touched it directly on camera, but the gesture, a quick, almost spastic verification, was enough. The locket was her anchor, her secret heart. The first report from the London asset arrived 3 days later. Encrypted and compressed into a single, dense data file, Gideon opened it immediately in the auxiliary bunker, the only place he felt safe enough to digest this intelligence. The report confirmed a match on the vocal characteristics, the specific quality of the alto, the breath control under stress, and the subtle regional inflections pointed toward an extremely specialized, almost archaic form of classical vocal training. Conclusion. The voice exhibited the characteristics of a highly trained singer, likely educated in a rigorous traditional conservatory environment, but who had undergone a significant period of disuse or emotional trauma that had altered the technical perfection, injecting raw, uncontrolled sorrow into the tone. The song itself was not an existing piece, but bore structural resemblance to a specific cycle of mid-19th century Italian arie di sospiri arias of sighs, dedicated to lost children or forbidden love. Gideon stared at the words, highly trained singer. The maid who refused to meet anyone's gaze, who scrubbed floors and polished brass, was a professional-level vocalist, someone who, by right, should be standing on the world's most prestigious stages, not silently dusting his paranoia-fueled command center. The revelation was profound and horrifying. This wasn't just hidden vulnerability, this was a hidden life, a fundamental contradiction that destabilized every assumption Gideon had about character, ambition, and trajectory. Why would someone with such a rare, valuable talent choose complete, humiliating anonymity? The answer pointed inevitably back to trauma. Whatever forced Clara into the Ashworth estate was powerful enough to suppress a world-class career. She was hiding not a crime, but a personal catastrophe. And the one thing Gideon understood better than anyone was the extreme lengths people would go to protect themselves from the repercussions of catastrophe. This deeper understanding transformed his fear into something closer to intellectual awe. Clara wasn't hiding from him. She was hiding from the world. And in his world, Gideon was the ultimate gatekeeper, the ultimate protector, or the ultimate destroyer. He felt an unwelcome surge of possessiveness. This raw talent, this immense sorrow, existed now solely within his sphere of knowledge. He had to keep her safe, not for her sake, but because she represented a unique kind of truth he had never encountered. The psychological tension mounted over the following week, transforming Gideon's state of being. He was functioning on pure adrenaline, running his organization on autopilot, while his internal focus was entirely consumed by the invisible Maid. He found himself manipulating his own schedule just to be near her perimeter. He would take phone calls in the main drawing room while she was polishing the adjacent glass display cases. He never looked at her, adhering to the silent pact that maintained her illusion of privacy. But he listened. He listened for the slightest variation in her breathing, the faintest scrape of her shoe on the parquet, the mechanical rhythm of her work. He was waiting for a mistake. Not a mistake in her cleaning, but a mistake in her composure. A moment where the sorrow overwhelmed the mask, forcing another leak of that devastating voice. This proximity was necessary for his investigation, but it came at a psychological cost. Clara's constant presence, her silent, meticulous motion became an almost unbearable pressure. She was a silent judgment on his chaotic, violent life. One afternoon, Gideon was pacing the second-floor gallery, engaged in a heated, highly sensitive discussion with his consigliere over an unsecured line. The stakes were high, a breach in the harbor protocols that could cost millions. His focus was absolute. Clara entered the gallery at the far end, pushing a heavy cart laden with cleaning supplies. She was nearly 50 yards away, moving with her characteristic quietness. Gideon paused mid-sentence, his voice dropping instinctively. He watched her in the peripheral vision, noting her lowered gaze, the slight slump of her shoulders under the weight of the day's duties. Then came the climax of the tension, a moment of profound, paralyzing risk. Gideon, gesturing fiercely during the argument, stumbled slightly over a thick antique rug. The sudden, uncontrolled movement caused the heavily ornate, silver-framed cell phone he was holding, his operational line, ringing with the voice of his consigliere, to slip from his grip. The sound in the silent, massive hall was deafening. It broke the profound quiet of the estate like a gunshot. Gideon instantly froze, his breath catching in his throat. His entire, meticulously constructed facade was about to be obliterated. Clara, 50 yards away, stopped dead. Her entire body language shifted from meek subservience to acute, animalistic alertness. Her head remained lowered, but her eyes, Gideon saw them just for a fraction of a second, flick up toward him, sharp and immediate, before instantly dropping again. In that millisecond of direct observation, Gideon saw not the shy maid, but the terrified, highly compartmentalized professional singer. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by a momentary defensive assessment of the threat. She wasn't worried about the dropped phone. She was worried about him, about the potential of a sudden loud sound from the boss signaling an immediate danger that could compromise her safe anonymity. Gideon felt his own heart pound violently against his ribs. He had just confirmed his deepest fear. She wasn't meek. She was perpetually vigilant. He instinctively maintained his frozen stance for a beat too long, maintaining the fiction that he was simply startled by the noise, not by her reaction. He forced himself to bend down slowly, picking up the still ringing phone. The line was cut, Antonio. Technical glitch. Continue the report. Gideon barked into the receiver, his voice tight with suppressed adrenaline, ignoring the frantic questions coming from the other end. Clara immediately resumed her movements, pushing the cart forward, her gaze locked firmly on the floor. She moved past him, maintaining the maximum distance possible, the perfect image of a staff member trying to become invisible after a minor disturbance. But the moment had passed, and the damage was done. Gideon was shaken, not because he had dropped the phone, but because Clara's reaction had been too sharp, too immediate. She didn't flinch like a servant. She tensed like a predator being startled out of hiding. That short moment of shared, acute silence had been more intimate and revealing than the entire session in the gilded library. In the library, she believed she was alone. Here she knew he was present, and she reacted to his disruption with trained efficiency. Gideon felt the cold realization settle. He wasn't just observing a vulnerable woman. He was interacting with a highly volatile operative whose true allegiance to her secret self superseded all other considerations. The incident in the gallery underscored the necessity of distance, yet Gideon found himself craving proximity. He needed to understand the mechanics of her performance. He initiated the final stage of the Lockett inquiry through his network. The musicology report had provided context for the talent. He needed context for the grief. The search was for a specific antique sterling silver locket, likely European, featuring a specific hallmark and engraving, sold or lost recently under unusual circumstances. This required accessing black market sales records, police filings for rare thefts under the guise of searching for stolen family heirlooms, and deep dives into probate and estate sales. The investigation led to a small, isolated town in rural Italy, far from the polished marble of the Ashworth estate, a place known for an insular community and a historic music academy. The data slowly trickled in, forming a picture that was both tragic and expected. Clara, under a different, more professional name, had been a prodigious, almost fabled talent at the academy. Her specialty was the demanding, emotionally draining repertoire of the 19th century laments. She was poised for a major international career. The locket was a gift from her mentor, a man or perhaps a family member who had vanished or died tragically about 2 years prior, coinciding exactly with Clara's sudden professional disappearance and her subsequent entry into the discreet domestic service agency. The cause of the trauma was clear: loss. The extent of the suppression was now terrifyingly apparent. She hadn't just changed jobs, she had erased her identity. Gideon sat in the darkness of the bunker, reading the sanitized police reports of the disappearance. A boating accident, insufficient evidence, a case gone cold. The report spoke of the mentor's profound connection to the art, the academy, and to Clara. The sterling silver locket, now identified in the sales records, contained a miniature photograph. The details were too blurred in the image provided by the asset, but the context was overwhelming. The locket was not a key to a secret device. It was a mausoleum for a lost love or a lost life. This discovery did not bring closure. It brought a different kind of operational panic. The emotional variable was confirmed, but its sheer depth meant Clara was potentially more dangerous than any spy. A person motivated by deep, unresolvable grief, tethered to a powerful hidden talent, operated outside the normal rules of leverage. She was immune to threats of money or position. The only thing Gideon could threaten was her secret, and by threatening that, he risked detonating an internal catastrophe that would certainly spill over onto him. Gideon's priorities solidified. He had to keep her secret safe, not just from Silas or the external world, but from Clara herself. He needed to ensure she never felt compelled to sing in his presence again, believing the gilded library was her only sanctuary. He needed to create a new sanctuary for her, one she could utilize without him being aware of it, a controlled leak of emotion. He ordered Silas to begin soundproofing a remote, unused annex on the 3rd floor, ostensibly for archival storage needing environmental control. He would equip it subtly with instruments, a pristine piano, perhaps a classical guitar, and ensure the space was scheduled for deep cleaning only during Clara's operational hours, guaranteeing her access when the estate was otherwise silent. This was unprecedented. Gideon Kincaid, the brutal orchestrator of global crime, was creating a performance space for his shy Maid, a psychological relief valve disguised as a storage closet. He looked back at the surveillance feeds. Clara was in the kitchen stacking dinnerware, her movements flawless. She was a ghost of her former self, a silent monument to loss. Gideon felt the grip of his paralysis tighten. He wasn't frozen by her capacity for destruction, but by his own, entirely unwelcome capacity for protective empathy. He was now actively managing the emotional state of a subordinate, a weakness that could be leveraged by any enemy who knew how to look past the surface. He realized the true scale of the deception. The test had not been a confrontation, it was a seduction into a secret life. Clara had revealed her soul, and in doing so had subtly, irrevocably corrupted Gideon's operational integrity. He closed the file on Project Nightingale. The enigma was solved, but the problem was now existential. He couldn't eliminate her, he couldn't promote her, he couldn't leave her alone. He was bound to her silence. Gideon left the auxiliary bunker, ascending to the main floors. He needed to re-establish control over his external life, to prove to himself and to Silas that he was still the decisive, ruthless leader. But every meeting, every decision about territory or profit felt thin and inconsequential compared to the profound, terrifying depth of the sorrow locked inside the Maid, who silently navigated the perimeter of his power. He walked past the gilded library, pausing only to run his finger over the brass doorknob. He felt a fierce, strange loyalty to the room now. It was the confessional, the place where his world had broken quietly and beautifully. Gideon knew he could never again look at Clara and see a shy, insignificant servant. He saw the potential for transcendent art and the terrifying, volatile grief that fueled it. The meekness was the defense, the talent was the vulnerability, and his knowledge was the ultimate unspoken bond. He had captured an enigma, and in doing so he had become the sole custodian of a secret that defined both her life and the unexpected, profound limitations of his own. The test was over. The result was a permanent state of psychological captivity. Gideon accepted his fate. He would rule his world of violence and fear, but his heart would forever be listening for the faint, mournful echo of a song meant for no one but the silent walls of his fortress. Smash the like, join the family.